Johnson County, Wyoming Territory, January 1886. The floor loom in the corner of the cabin weighed 240 pounds and stood 6 feet tall. Lars Strand had built it from oak and hickory in the summer of 1883. 2 years after they left Gothenburg, he had carved their initials into the upper beam with a pocket knife on their wedding morning, KFLFF 1883. He never lived to see what it was built for. Elin Strand was 27. She had 2 children, $44 in debt, 180 pounds of raw fleece, and a loom that no one had used since June. Oscar, 15, carried his father's folding knife and had not opened it since the funeral. Britta, 12, kept a measurement notebook and wrote in it, whether anyone asked her to or not. Brandt ran the largest cattle operation between Clearwater and Buffalo and had an opinion about widows who gave away 6 months of winter supplies to a neighbor's burned-out storehouse. He said the opinion out loud. He only needed to say it once. The blizzard that arrived in January held temperatures at 28 degrees below zero, drove 45 miles per hour of wind for 3 consecutive days, and dropped 20 inches of snow in the first 36 hours. Brandt had no wool panels on his western windows. His feed barn lost a wall timber in the night. 4 cattle did not survive until morning. 9 panels of rug-weight wool covered every opening in Elin's cabin. She had woven them herself in 11 weeks, beginning from raw unwashed fleece, starting the whole calculation over twice from scratch. One of them had already failed before the storm arrived. She had repaired it anyway. The loom Lars built had never been used for warmth. At about to be, Lars Strand died on a Thursday in June 1885. He had climbed to the roof of the feed barn to nail down 3 replacement boards before the July heat expanded the old ones loose. Elin found him 2 hours later, face down in the yard. One boot still caught on the top rung of the ladder. The hammer lay 4 feet from his hand. She did not call out. There was no one within 12 miles who would have heard her. She went inside, put water on for coffee, then came back out. She sat beside him until the afternoon light changed. Then she did what needed to be done. Oscar was 15. He carried his father's folding knife in his shirt pocket from that day forward, and did not take it out for any reason. Britta was 12. She kept the measurement notebook she used at school and began copying into it things nobody had asked her to copy. In July, Elin found the debt. Lars had run a feed bill of $26 at the co-op through the dry summer of 1884. Then an $18 tab at the general store in Buffalo. She spread both slips of paper on the kitchen table beside her remaining cash. The cash came to $11.40. She made an inventory. The floor loom Lars had built from oak and hickory in 1883 stood against the north wall of the main cabin, on its upper beam, carved into the wood with a pocket knife on the morning of their wedding, were the letters, Kelf, 1883. Karin and Lars Falk, their name before the immigration records changed it. She ran her finger across the letters once. Then she moved on. Beside the loom, 180 pounds of raw fleece from the summer shearing, 6 months of dyed and spun yarn she had worked since February, gold from weld grass, brown from walnut hulls, gray from a mordant batch she did not yet know was wrong. 2 children who ate every day, regardless of what else was happening. The $11 would cover neither debt in full. She wrote 2 letters, one to the co-op, promising payment by spring, one to the store. She sealed both and handed them to Britta to hold until the next wagon went to Buffalo. On the workbench in the barn, Lars's hickory shuttle lay where he had left it the last day he had used it, 14 inches long, 1.5 inches thick. The surface worn to a deep beeswax finish from years of his hands, passing it back and forth through the shed. She could see it from the barn doorway. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the spinning wheel and continued with the fleece she had started that morning. She was behind by 2 weeks already, and the fleece would not wait. The loom Lars built had never been used for warmth. It was about to be, in August. Elin scoured 3 new batches of raw fleece in the creek and spread them over the cottonwood fence rail to dry in the shade. The process was the same her grandmother had taught her in Gothenburg when she was 12. Cold water soak first to release the lanolin without felting, then the hot scour bath at 140 degrees, then the rinse with no agitation, then the drying away from direct sun at 4,600 feet. The water never quite reached a full boil. She learned to read the temperature by the sound of the pot. a low, sustained hiss instead of the climbing rattle, before rolling boil, and by the smell. Hot lanolin and mineral water, like rain striking warm stone, she carded the clean wool in the evenings by lamp light. Both hands moved without thought, the process automatic enough that she could keep accounts in her head while her hands worked. She was behind on the dye work. The fleece from 6 batches was clean and carded but not yet spun. The loan letters had gone to Buffalo. She had received no replies. In September she began the mordanting in earnest. She worked through the alum she had laid in from the previous year, 68 grams per pound of fiber, dissolved first in warm water, then brought up slowly to 160 degrees with the wet wool submerged, 45 minutes at temperature, not less, not more. Less, and the dye would not take evenly. More, and the fiber began to break down at the molecular level, losing tensile strength in ways that would not show for months. When the alum jar ran low, she went to the shelf where Lars had kept his dyeing materials. He had ordered supplies from a textile firm in St. Louis, 2 jars of similar-looking white crystals. Both on the same shelf, she lifted the second jar and tipped some into her palm. White crystals, slightly finer than the alum. The label was in Lars's handwriting, in Swedish. Oscar came into the room just then and asked about supper, and she answered him while measuring out the crystals by weight, 3 grams per pound, the same as the alum she had been using. It was not the same ratio, it was not the same compound. The dye bath that followed smelled slightly different, sharper at the back of the throat, a faint metallic note she attributed to the iron content in the Clearwater well water. The gray batch had a deep, even color, darker than anything she had achieved with alum alone. She thought briefly that she should use whatever was in the second jar more often. She moved on. On October 18th, fire took the Henriksen winter stores. Sigrid Henriksen was 52. And had been at Clearwater Flat longer than anyone except the Pearsons. The outbuilding caught first from a chimney ember, a single, wind-blown spark onto a dry shingle that no one saw in time. 3 neighboring families had kept surplus there for the season. By morning the structure was down to its stone foundation, and everything inside it was ash. Elin heard the news from Oscar, who had gotten it from the Pearson boy passing at a trot on the road. She went out to the yard and stood looking west at the Bighorn Ridge line for a long moment. The mountains held their position. The sky was the color of old pewter. Then she went to the barn and began loading the wagon. 6 months of spun and dyed yarn, everything she had made since February. Everything Lars had spent his last good autumn helping her gather fleece for before the roof. Gold weld yarn, brown walnut yarn, the deep gray from the Miss Reed jar. She stacked it all without ceremony and hitched the horse. Carl Brandt was riding the fence line when her wagon passed. He was 43, ran the largest cattle operation between Clearwater and Buffalo, and had a habit of saying what he saw before he had thought long about what he was seeing. "Trading away your winter for someone else's," he said from horseback. Elin did not look up. She kept the horse moving. She left everything on the Henriksen porch. Sigrid came out and stood in the doorway. She did not say anything. Elin did not say anything. She drove the wagon home. Oscar did not speak at supper that evening. He ate his portion and went to his room. In the morning he came out for barn chores, which he did correctly and thoroughly. But when Elin went to the dye shed afterward, the barn door closed, and she heard nothing more from it. Until evening she kept the raw fleece. She kept the loom. She kept the $11, which were no longer enough for either debt. She had 8 weeks before the serious cold. She kept 3 things after Lars died. She would not know which one mattered most until January. She started warping on October 22nd. The calculation came first. Elin had always done the dyeing and the weaving. Lars had always done the numbers, warp length, set, shrinkage, loss. The arithmetic lived in his head, not on paper. She worked through it herself, with pencil on the back of one of the debt slips. She needed a panel long enough to cover the main door frame, with 12 inches of overlap on each side. The door was 7 feet 2 inches tall. She added the overlap. She added what she guessed take-up and loom waste. She came up with 8 yards. She wound 8 yards onto the warping board. Slide the 6-dent reed at one end per dent across the full 30-inch panel with 180 warp ends total, and threaded the heddles in a 4-shaft straight draw. Shaft 1 through 4 repeating, she began weaving. The first panel came off the loom. In 10 days she put it into the hot water finishing tub at 140 degrees and worked it for 15 minutes without twisting, keeping the agitation even. Then she lifted it out and spread it on the floor. It had shrunk, not slightly. The length had contracted 15%, the width 10. She had accounted for neither. Britta was in the room. She picked up the measuring tape from the shelf and walked to the door frame, then to the panel. She held the tape to both. "That won't reach the sill," she said. Elin sat at the table. She pulled the pencil from her apron and spent 15 minutes on the calculations she should have done the first time. Target length divided by 0.855 for length shrinkage, divided again by 0.90 for take-up, multiplied by 120 for loom waste. The number that came out was not 8 yards. 12 yards, she said. Not 8. The loom takes what it takes. She pulled the panel off the drying floor, unthreaded the entire warp from the loom, and started over. Britta copied the formula into her measurement notebook. Then she copied it again onto a strip of paper. Pressed the paper against the upper beam of the loom with a thumb of tallow to make it hold, and stepped back to check it was readable. The second warping took 3 days. The corrected first panel came off the loom on November 12th. Britta lifted it from the finishing tub with both hands and almost lost it. The finished panel weighed 4.5 pounds per running yard. "Heavy," she said, and that was all. Elin hung the panel over the door frame. It covered the opening and overlapped the frame on all sides. She pressed her palm flat against the wool surface. The panel did not flex in the draft from the door gap. The weft was packed at 12 picks per inch, across 30 inches of width, the finished thickness nearly 3/8 of an inch. She pressed harder. Nothing moved. She began panel 2 the following morning. Before she sat down at the loom, her left hand touched the carving on the upper beam. Kef Elf, 1883. She did not look at it when she touched it. Her hand was already reaching for the bench before she had stopped moving. She lifted the hickory shuttle, Lars's shuttle, 14 inches. The beeswax, finished deep from his hands and beginning to be deep from hers, and threw it through the open shed. In the first week, her learning had shown in small ways. The shuttle slipping from her grip at an awkward angle, the shed not fully cleared, the beat uneven. She had pulled back damaged picks and rewoven them rather than letting errors accumulate. The work was slow. It was also accurate. After 3 weeks, something changed. She reached for the shuttle without looking. Her hand closed on the familiar shape and brought it through the shed in a single fluid motion. Before she was entirely aware she had initiated it, she beat the weft down, the beater landing with a solid, dense thud against the fell line, not hollow, not glancing, but the deep sound that meant the weft was going where it belonged. She threw the shuttle back. Beat, throw, beat. She did not look at the warp. She did not look at her hands. Carl Brandt rode past in late November on the roan horse whose hoofbeats she could identify from 400 yards. On a still morning, he stopped at the fence. He looked at the panels drying on the cottonwood rail, gold, brown, the second gray batch. He did not call out. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes and then rode on. Britta saw him from the window and wrote in her notebook, "Mr. B at fence, approx 11 in the morning, did not stop long." Elin was in the dye shed and did not know he had been there until Britta told her at supper. She served the soup and said nothing about it. In December, Oscar returned to the barn during the mornings. He did not explain, and Elin did not ask. He filled the water trough before she got to it, restacked the split wood in the lean-to against the cabin wall, and disappeared into the house before she came in from the dye shed. She found the chores done and made no remark. The evenings were quiet. He sat at the table while she spun. And in early December he began whittling a short piece of scrap wood, no particular shape emerging, the shavings curling to the floor while the lamp burned low. Panel 6 went up December 8th. Panel 7 December 14th. Panel 8 the 21st. Each one mounted with wool batting pressed into the frame gap first, then the panel pinned at top and bottom with heavy iron tacks through the frame trim. She oriented each panel with the warp running horizontally across the opening rather than vertically, so the weft density bore the wind load rather than the warp threads, the direction the fiber was strongest. The 9th panel, the largest, covering the 3-foot wide western window in the sleeping room, was built from the last of the deep gray batch. The gray died from the wrong jar. Elin pulled it from the finishing tub and pressed it in her hands. Something in the texture was not quite right. The surface fibers were stiffer than the corresponding section of panel 2, which had come from the same fleece lot with the correct alum mordant. She pressed harder. The weft resisted differently, not weak, not obviously damaged, but with a quality like weathered rope rather than fresh worked wool. She carried it to the sleeping room window and began mounting it. Britta came in while she was setting the tacks. "This one feels different," Britta said. She pressed her palm against the panel the way Elin always did. "It'll hold," Elin said. She finished tacking the panel and moved on to the next task. There was no fiber left to redo it, no time to weave another, and no obvious structural failure visible in the wool. She had said it would hold. 8 panels hung on the wall. The 9th was already wrong. She did not know it yet. On January 10th, Elin pulled the mordanting ledger from the shelf above the workbench. She had started keeping records after the warp calculation failure, 1 entry per batch. Noting the fiber weight, the chemical weight, the temperature held, and the time, she turned to the gray batch. The fiber weight was there, the temperature was correct. The chemical entry read, mordant white crystals, 14 grams per pound. Of fiber, she stopped. 68 grams per pound was the correct ratio for alum. 15% of the fiber weight. 14 grams per pound was 3%. 3% was the standard working ratio for ferrous sulfate, which produced iron mordant. She had not run a diluted alum dose. She had used a different chemical entirely. Lars had kept his iron mordant on the same shelf as the alum. Both were white or pale crystals. He had used iron mordant for his own gray batches. When he wanted a deeper tone, the crystals were denser, slightly more cream-colored than alum's clearer white. In the lamplight of an October evening, with Oscar asking a question behind her, she had not looked closely enough. She set the ledger down. Iron mordant in the well water at Clearwater Flat, which ran high in dissolved iron from the limestone beneath, produced a specific reaction in wool fiber. Iron ions bound with the natural tannins present in the water and in the wool itself, forming a compound that was stable in mild conditions. Under repeated thermal cycling, daily heat from the stove, nightly cold from the glass, the compound became brittle. Not immediately. Over 8 to 10 weeks, the gray panel had been mounted for 3 weeks. It had cycled through day and night temperatures more than 40 times. She walked to the sleeping room window and pressed a handful of the weft threads between her fingers. They did not stretch, they yielded slightly, and then returned with a stiffness not broken, not obviously degraded, but lacking the elastic recovery that undamaged wool produced. Like leather beginning to dry from the inside, she thought about taking the panel down. She thought about replacing it with doubled raw fleece batting pinned at the edges, but the western window was the largest opening in the cabin, and the panel was cut to fit it exactly. She had no fiber left, and no time to weave another before the cold that was already coming. She went to the sewing basket and found the heaviest linen thread. She cut a length 4 yards long and doubled it, then threaded the largest needle. She spent 2 hours stitching reinforcing lines across all 4 corners, and along both vertical edges, the points that would take the first stress from wind load. The stitches went through the panel and through a strip of canvas backing she cut from the barn supply and pressed against the rear face. Oscar appeared in the doorway at supper time. "What are you doing?" he said. "Stitching the corners," Elin said. He watched for a moment, then went to the stove to check the pot. She finished the stitching and put the needle and the remaining thread into the front pocket of her work apron. She did not remove them. On the morning of January 12th, the smoke from Brandt's chimney, visible from the western window at 2 miles distance, lay flat and pressed east instead of rising. The atmospheric pressure was changing. The dog came inside before noon and would not leave. The smoke had gone flat an hour before that. Gro came in from the yard at 10 in the morning on January 13th and went directly to the floor beside the stove. He was Oscar's dog, Gray, heavy-bodied, named for his color and nothing else, and he had not voluntarily stayed inside during daylight hours since the previous winter. He lay with his chin on his front paws and his eyes on the window and did not ask to go out again. Elin watched the smoke. Brandt's chimney had been running flat since before dawn, the column not rising but pressing east in a solid horizontal layer, as though the sky above it had become a ceiling. By 11, the Bighorn ridgeline to the west had disappeared behind a wall of gray moving south from the northern horizon. Not cloud. Something denser than cloud. A mass of air so cold it carried its own visibility, the moisture freezing before it fell. She told Britta to cut the batting strips she had set aside and seal every window gap. Starting with the north-facing ones, she told Oscar to bring the remaining cord of wood from the far stack before the path closed, and to bring both horses into the barn stalls with the cattle. She went to the sleeping room window and checked the panel, mounting herself, pressing each corner in turn. Testing the reinforcing stitches she had put in 2 days before the linen thread held against her pull. She pressed the center of the panel flat against the glass. No air came through. She left the needle and thread in her apron pocket. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had shifted to full north. It arrived at 4, not a gust that built a wall. The north-facing panel across the main door sucked inward, bowed, and snapped back against its tacking, with a sound like a flat hand striking a tabletop. The stovepipe groaned once and steadied. The eastern windows on the lee side went white with heat meeting cold air leaching through the glass. Elin lit both oil lamps and distributed them. One to the kitchen, one to the sleeping room. Outside the temperature dropped. 7 degrees by 5 o'clock, below 0 by 7. The snow was not falling in any direction that could be called down. It was moving horizontally, driven into the north face of the cabin in continuous sheets that packed themselves into the batting gaps and compressed further against the panel faces. Elin kept the stove loaded every 2 hours through the night. She split the watch with Oscar. Without being asked, she woke him at midnight, and he did not argue. He kept the stove through the early morning hours while she slept in the chair beside it. Britta slept on the kitchen floor near the hearth, rolled in the 2 heaviest blankets, her measurement notebook tucked inside the blankets beside her. At 1 in the morning, the sustained wind reached 45 miles per hour. At 2, it was pushing 50. The north wall of the cabin produced a continuous low sound, not the sharp crack of gusts, but the deeper vibration of sustained pressure. The wood and the insulation bearing a load that did not let up. 8 panels held. At 3 in the morning, panel 9 failed. It did not fail completely. It failed at the upper right corner, a small tearing almost quiet, the sound of a seam opening under steady tension. Then a hiss of air through a gap that had not existed an hour before. 4 inches of gap, the wind pressing through it cold and hard and continuous. Was awake, she heard it from the kitchen. She moved without lighting a lamp, using the gray ember light from the firebox that had banked to coals. She went to the sleeping room doorway. The gap showed as a thin line of dark against the lighter panel surface, dark meaning the cold outside. Visible because the panel was shifting slightly in the wind. The temperature in the sleeping room was already dropping. She could feel it at the doorway. In 20 minutes, it would be below 40 degrees in that room. She took the needle from her apron pocket. She threaded it by the coal light. The needle eye was small, and the thread was doubled and waxed from weeks in the apron pocket beside the beeswax of the shuttle. And her hands knew the motion without deliberation. She pressed the torn corner together. With her left hand, the wind struck the back of her knuckles like thrown ice and drove the first stitch through with her right. She did not rush it. Her grandmother had taught her about emergency. Seaming on harness leather haste-produced stitches with uneven tension. And uneven tension meant the seam would fail at the weakest point, and the whole repair would come undone at the wrong moment. She worked the needle in regular intervals, through the panel face, and through the canvas backing, pulling the thread tight enough to seat the stitch without puckering the fabric. After 20 minutes, Oscar appeared in the doorway. Behind her with the second lamp, he had heard the panel go. He had not been asleep. He held the lamp at the angle she needed without being directed to it. When she indicated without speaking that she needed, the panel held flat against the mounting. The wind was trying to belly it inward. With each gust he braced himself against the window frame with both hands and held it steady. He did not let it move. She worked the stitch line across the full width of the tier and reinforced both sides. She added a secondary line 6 inches below, where the stress would redistribute once the primary repair was under load. The wind hit the patch repeatedly while she was working on it. The patch held. At 5 in the morning, she tied off the final knot and bit the thread. "It'll hold," she said. Oscar set the lamp on the windowsill. He did not answer. The second day was colder than the first. The temperature held at 28 below zero from well before dawn until mid-afternoon. Wind reached 70 miles per hour in the gusts. The sounds against the north wall no longer individual impacts, but a sustained grinding pressure that did not abate for hours at a time. The snow had stopped adding depth. The ground was already full and was simply moving in horizontal sheets across the frozen surface, building against anything vertical. 8 panels held. The sleeping room panel held because of the doubled thread and 3 hours in the dark. The cattle in the barn were alive because of the second panel Elin had mounted across the barn's eastern entrance 6 weeks earlier. Oriented to cut the wind coming around the corner of the building, she had not told anyone she was going to do it. She had simply done it on a cold morning in November, when she had a panel to spare. At 2 in the afternoon on January 14th, someone knocked at the door. Elin opened it. Brandt stood on the step without his hat, his coat open at the front, ice on his beard. Behind him, a quarter-mile of unbroken white stretched to where his house would have been visible in clear weather. He looked like a man who had decided something and come to act on it before he could decide differently. 2 windows on the west side, he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in and stood near the stove until he was no longer moving from cold. Britta put a mug of hot water in front of him. There was no coffee left. No tea, nothing but water from the pot, and he drank it and said nothing for a long time. After an hour, he took off his coat. He sat in the chair angled toward the stove, Lars' chair, which nobody had moved from its position since June. He looked at the loom. In the corner, he looked at the panel on the sleeping room window from across the room. The patch was visible from where he sat, a ridge of tight stitching across the upper corner, the canvas backing showing at the edge where the original weave had torn away. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the formula Britta had pressed to the upper beam of the loom, still there after 2 months, the tallow holding the paper flat against the wood. He did not ask what it was. He read it. On the morning of January 16th, the pressure changed. The sound against the north wall dropped in pitch, became intermittent, let silence through between the gusts. By noon, the gusts were separated by long stretches of quiet. By 2 in the afternoon, the storm had ended. The storm ended on a Thursday. The valley did not look the same after. The snow was 4 feet deep in the open yard and drifted to 6 against the north face of the cabin. The sky on January 16th, when the storm ended, was the flat white gray of high overcast, no sun, no wind, no clouds with any definition. The world had been simplified to white below and gray above. Elin walked to the barn. The animals were alive. The panel at the barn entrance was intact, its surface packed with driven snow on the windward face, but holding behind it, she brushed the snow away and pressed the panel with her palm. It did not flex. She came back inside and made a list of what remained. 7 panels undamaged, 1 patched and functional, 1 auxiliary panel at the barn, a full cord of wood still in the lean-to. Enough grain for 3 weeks if she used it carefully. The cattle at Brandt's place had not fared as well. The damage there was visible from the road. 2 windows on the west face of the main house stood open to the sky. The wood around the openings darkened with exposure. The feed barn's windward wall had lost a major timber overnight when the sustained pressure found a weak point in the framing. 4 cattle had gone down before morning, not from the cold directly, but from lying on ground that had dropped below what cattle can sustain when there is no insulation between them and the air. Brandt stayed 2 more days at Elin's cabin, while the road was impassable. He slept on the kitchen floor near the stove. He ate at her table. He did not mention October. On the second morning she came in from the barn and found him standing at the loom. He was not touching it. He was reading the formula on the beam, the strip of paper Britta had pressed there in November, the calculation that turned a target panel length into the warped footage needed to produce it. He stood there for a while, with his hands at his sides. She hung up her coat and put water on the stove. He left on January 18th when the road was safe for a horse. After he was gone, Elin took the iron mordant jar from the dye shelf and carried it to the lower cabinet beneath the workbench. She set it on the bottom shelf. In the dark, she did not relabel it. She knew it now by weight, heavier than the alum jar by roughly a quarter pound, the crystals denser in the hand. More compacted, she would not confuse the two again. A label would say nothing that her hands did not already know. On January 28th, she heard hoofbeats from 400 yards and recognized the gate before she looked up. Then, an hour before that, Sigrid Henriksen had come to the door. Sigrid set a jar of pickled herring on the table, home-cured, Swedish style. 6 weeks in salt brine, she would have started it in December. Before the storm, she set it on the table and did not stay for coffee. Elin looked at the jar. She knew what it meant. Brandt came up the steps at 3 in the afternoon. He took his hat off. He sat down at the table and set the hat on the wood beside him. Elin said, 40 yards a panel, 40 bushels of wheat, spring delivery. He looked at the hat. Then he nodded once. He was gone before the light changed. Oskar came in from the barn a few minutes after. He stood in the doorway, pulling off his gloves, looking at the loom in the corner and then at his mother. "Can I try?" he said. Elin crossed to the workbench. She lifted the hickory shuttle from the bench. Lars's shuttle, 14 inches, the beeswax finish dark from 30 years of hands. She placed it into Oscar's palm. His fingers closed around it. His hand turned naturally, palm up, thumb running along the spine of the wood, the same grip Lars had used, not shown to him. Just there. Elin went to the tension beam and began adjusting the warp.